Question number 4, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Conservation, does she stand by all her statements?
Mr Speaker.
Order, order, order. There is just too much interjection going across the floor of the House. I'm going to invite the member to ask his question again.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Conservation. Does she stand by all her statements?
Honourable
Mr. Speaker.
Maggie Barry.
Yes, in the context in which they were made.
Supplementary question. Supplementary question, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister, will she provide the House with the credible evidence that she has seen supporting her statement in answer to question 8 on 23rd October that, quote, early monitoring has shown that numbers of rats, which had been up to 25 million, have now been knocked down to 0 in places where 1080 has been used? If not, why not?
Honourable Maggie Barry.
If the member is asking whether the update that we gave on the 1080 aerial drop in the battle for our birds has proved effective in bringing rat rates down to 0 proportions, the answer is yes.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, Richard Prosser.
No, I was not asking that, Mr Speaker. The question was, will she provide the House with the evidence?
I'll invite the member to ask the question again.
Again, thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister, will she provide the House with the credible evidence that she has seen supporting her statement in answer to question 8 on 23rd October that, and I quote, early monitoring has shown that numbers of rats, which had been up to 25 million, have now been knocked down to 0 in places where 1080 has been used? And if not, why not?
Honourable Maggie Barry.
Mr Speaker, the answer to that question and the proof that it is true lies in the results that the Department of Conservation has now come up with as of yesterday. Over 600,000 hectares have been dropped of aerial spray of 1080, and in the areas where rats have been measured to be at 77%, they are now at levels that we would consider very acceptable, around 2%. So that evidence has been in the evaluation of monitoring traps where rats have been found, and the numbers have dropped significantly, and those are the figures that the Department of Conservation has used.
Supplement.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order.
Not to labour the point, Mr Speaker, but the question is still, will she provide the House with the evidence?
Order. The point is now being laboured. The member's asked the question twice. He may not be satisfied with the answer, and I can understand why that be the case. The way forward is I will allow the member an additional supplementary question if he continues with his line of questioning. Richard Prosser, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister, why was her assurance about the safety of eating trout based on a misleading assessment of the pathway to 1080 toxicity?
Honourable Maggie Barry.
Mr Speaker, I refute the implication behind that. It was not misleading at all. And the Cawthron Institute has provided evidence which is contained within a report which backs that up.
Supplementary question, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Why did she give the House an assurance about the safety of eating trout which had eaten mice which had eaten 1080 based on a test which at the time had not been done?
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Maggie Barry.
In fact, the data and the evidence had been gathered at that time. It has not changed. MPI have analysed the data that was put together by the Cawthron Institute and have found that the findings are accurate. The use of 1080 has not harmed the trout. They survived, and that the amounts of 1080 within the trout are not harmful to human beings. And that is a conclusion of MPI when they analysed the data for the Cawthron Institute.
Supplementary question, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given that the test on trout which have eaten mice which have eaten 1080 has still not been done, is she still prepared to stand by her statement that an average adult would have to eat many times their body weight in one sitting in trout that had ingested mice that had eaten 1080 to experience any health ill effects whatsoever?
Honourable Maggie Barry.
I go back to the MPI assessment, which was released last month, which indicated that at the peak levels of 1080, temporarily recorded in the force-fed laboratory trouts, it's not some kind of bush experiment. This was a scientifically conducted experiment in a laboratory situation where trout were force-fed extreme amounts of 1080, and there were no ill effects on the trout, and there were not residues, and this evidence was examined and interpreted by MPI, who are the expert toxicologist that it has no harm or risk to human life. I am happy to provide the member with the Cawthron Institute's uptake, and if the member would choose to go on the website, Mr Speaker, you can certainly see the MPI conclusions contained there.
Supplementary question, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Minister maintaining the position that the tests were done on trout that had eaten mice that had eaten 1080 rather than on trout that had eaten 1080 directly?
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Maggie Berry.
The mice in a laboratory situation were force-fed extreme amounts of 1080, far more than they would have ever been likely to find in a field situation. The amounts of 1080 that they were fed, vastly more than they would find in the field, did not affect the health of the trout, nor were the amounts of 1080 in the trout, which dispersed over time, deemed to be of any level that was a risk to human life.
Supplementary question.
Thank
Order.
you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister.
Supplementary question, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister, given her statement that there is more 1080 in a cup of tea, will the Minister give the House an assurance that she is just as happy and willing to eat a 1080 poison bait as she is to drink a cup of tea? And if not, why not?
The evidence around Mr Speaker.
Honourable Maggie Berry.
Mr Speaker, the claim that 1080 poisons our waterway is not true, and I used the cup of tea to really try and make that apparent to the members, the former member of your party that asked me this question a few weeks ago. Let's be very clear on this. The facts are that 1080 breaks down very quickly when exposed to water. 500 water samples have been taken from 1080 aerial operations over the past 5 years. No trace of 1080 has been found in the samples taken from drinking water catchments. Only 2% of other samples had any detectable level, and all were less than 1/10 of the tolerable exposure limit of 3.5 parts per billion. To put this in perspective, which is what I was trying to do for the member, 1080 naturally occurs in your everyday cup of tea at levels above 10 parts per billion. So if the member wants to call for a moratorium on 1080, perhaps the member might also like to call for a moratorium on cups of tea.
Order. Question